Well, good evening. It's good to be here this evening. It's good to see so many of you. I am reminded a few weeks ago, Glenn made some comments about when a preacher has time to prepare, that usually their lessons will run shorter. And I have had a lot of time to sit and think the last week because I've been 36 hours in the car or something too close to that. So, in theory, this should be a short lesson. But theory is a different realm from perhaps where we are. We'll find out at the end of the lesson how short it is. But I have to warn you, the inspiration for my sermon this evening comes from a Ray Stevens song. Some of you don't know who Ray Stevens is. That is a detriment to you. Become cultured. But it's specifically a song by the name of the Mississippi Squirrel Revival. And some of you may have heard this song. I can tell who's heard that song. For one reason or another, that song has been on my mind the last couple of days. Perhaps it's because I was driving through Pascagoula, Mississippi. But regardless, the song, if you're not familiar with it, is about the songwriter who, at the time, is telling the story about when he was a young boy, and he would go to an old country church, and back when he was visiting his grandmother, he went and caught a squirrel, and then he put that squirrel in a box, and unbeknownst to anyone else, he brought that squirrel into the church building. Sitting in the back pew, he decides to show it to his friend, and this squirrel, ever the escape artist, decides now is his moment to escape. And so he escapes down the pews, much to the chagrin of the storyteller. Now, this is where things get interesting. This is just a humdrum, mundane service until this squirrel crawls up the pants leg of one of the members. And suddenly he stands up and says, "Something has a hold on me." And he runs down to the front and begs for mercy and begs for forgiveness and begs for grace, and the whole congregation is not sure what to do, and there's one more judgmental member of the congregation sitting up front and snickering and sneering until the squirrel finds her, and she stands up and she starts confessing all of her sins in front of the entire congregation. And that congregation thought, there is something going on here today. And the entire congregation had a revival. They were all rededicated to that day. Many of them were baptized or rebaptized. Several of them committed to going to missions in the Congo. It was quite an ordeal. And let me tell you, I wish I could tell that story as well as that song does, but it is just such an interesting concept. This idea that one mishappening, perhaps, is what caused so much good to occur, right? So many people changed their lives in that story because of something that they did not understand, or perhaps it pushed them to do something which they knew they should have done because something went awry. Something did not go according to plan. Perhaps in that story you could say that old country church was going through a stage of complacency, and that half-crazed Mississippi squirrel set them in a different direction and motivated them to change their path a little bit. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about complacency and covetousness and anxiety. Now, those three things may not seem like they go together very well, but Jesus actually puts them all together here in Luke chapter 12, which is where we're going to be this evening. Luke chapter 12, Jesus has been teaching quite a bit. He's been telling several stories, and he's certainly not done telling his stories. If you go through the book of Luke, you'll find a lot of Jesus' parables and stories. And this one is one that perhaps we often glance over, but it's one that I think tells a pretty good story. Jesus is approached as he's teaching by an individual in the crowd who comes to him in verse 13 and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you?" So this man comes out of the crowd and he says, "Teacher, Rabbi, you seem like you know what you're talking about. You seem like a fair judge of character. You seem like you know what the law is supposed to state. Why don't you tell my brother over here that he needs to whip it into shape and give me what's mine?" And Jesus says, that is not my job, first of all. And then he says this, in verse 15, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Now, Jesus makes a fairly obvious statement here. One's life is not consistent of just their possessions. And while we may understand that on a surface level, and we may say, well, the life is more than just our things, right? We understand that. We may say that out loud, but our actions speak something else sometimes. And in the case of this man, he's seeking to have what he thinks is owed to him. He's seeking to just have more. He feels like he doesn't have enough, and he's wanting Jesus to intervene and give him what's his so that he can have enough. And Jesus is warning him, you need to watch out that your covetousness does not overtake you. This idea that your life is made up of what you have can be a very dangerous one. So then he tells this story, verse 16. "The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Now there's a lot of different aspects of that story that I find entertaining. One of my favorite parts is that he says to his soul, "Soul," and I don't know how that works. I've never been able to talk to my soul that way in like a third-person situation. But apart from that, Jesus is pointing out that this individual is fairly well off. This person is producing more than he needs, and in response to that, he decides, you know what, I'm going to just build up larger barns. I'm going to store up as much as I can. I am going to make sure that I can sit back, relax, and not have to worry about a thing. That seems like a pretty nice life. This is what it says in verse 20. "But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." Now there's a few points to be made in this last part of this story, the conclusion of this story. First of all, God points out that his life, he's being rather foolish. Remember, who is it that he has addressed and says, look, you have so much. Look, you are well taken care of. Look, you have nothing to worry about. He says specifically his soul. Hey, soul, you don't need to worry about it anymore. I got plenty of things. And God says, nope, that's not going to really help you because it's your soul that I'm going to demand right now. The irony of this story is that this man, for some reason, thought that if he had enough things, his soul was taken care of. And yet God says, no, nothing that you have is going to really be of use to you in this regard, because at any point in time, your life could be taken from you. Your soul could be taken from you. And so he says, this is what somebody who lays up treasures for himself on earth and does not seek God looks like. Someone who ironically is trying to gain things for themselves as though it's going to benefit them, when at the end of the day, they're really creating nothing for themselves. The man who laid up for himself all these treasures and built bigger barns for himself, he did not secure his soul. He didn't do anything to benefit his soul, truthfully. At the end of the day, he was just left with his relationship with God, and that's all that any of us is going to be left with at the end of the day. But this is what I find interesting. We move on to a different section of Luke, one that we read often apart from this story, but the two are seemingly connected in verse 22. And he said to his disciples, "Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing." anytime you read, this is what they told me in, actually I think it was in my 3rd grade Bible class, but they also told me this in college. Anytime you run across the Bible and you see a therefore, you want to know what the therefore is there for. That seems redundant, but when we look at this here in verse 22, we see that. We see that there is some connection back to what we just said. Why is he saying therefore? What was the purpose of what he just said? He's giving a reason for what he's saying. He's giving a reason for saying, don't be anxious about these things. And if we look back and we take a look at the context of this story that Jesus is telling, and remember the context is that he's warning someone about covetousness, we realize that covetousness can lead to complacency, or it can lead to anxiety. These are the warnings that Jesus is trying to give us. He says you need to watch out for covetousness because it can do some pretty terrible things to you. For one, if you worry so much about what you have and you seek complacency, and you seek to have the things all figured out to where you can just sit back and relax and not have to worry about it, then you've missed the point. You have misunderstood your mission if that is what you aspire to do. And quite frankly, we live in a society where complacency has become the new nirvana. The religious concept, not the band, by the way. The idea of complacency and being able to live a life where you can sit back and relax and not have to worry about anything, that is what our society strives for. That is their idea of reaching the end. That's their idea of reaching the finish line. If you can get to that place where you don't have to worry about anything, then you've won. You've finished the job. Good job. We'll all give you a round of applause and call it a day. But Jesus says that is not at all the way that you should be living your life. You should be living your life in such a way that you are constantly seeking the kingdom of God, understanding that the kingdom of God is going to be enough for you. Now, when he tells this story and he starts to talk about not being anxious, that is a difficult passage for me. I have struggled with this passage a lot in my life. Okay, if I could probably call myself an expert at this point on being anxious, I'm really good at it. Okay. But when Jesus is addressing this anxiety, and he says, don't be anxious in your life about these things, he's addressing this idea that we have to seek this. We have to seek this complacency. We have to seek to have enough. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter how long we look, we're really never going to have enough, not by the world's standards. And maybe there is a time at which we say, well, maybe if I can just get those things settled and I don't have to worry about any of those things, then I'll be happy and I can just sit back and relax. But at any point in time, those things could be taken away. See, those things are not tied to my soul. Nothing about my material possessions is going to give me points getting into heaven. Nothing about my material possessions is going to allow me to have a more secure relationship with God. Those things are temporal. And if we seek those things and that becomes the driving force of our life, then we are going to constantly be worrying about these things because at any moment in time they could disappear. And so this is the lie that the world perpetuates. One, that we need to strive to have enough. And two, that there is never enough. And you see it pretty easily if you turn on the television. I mean, that is what marketing in this world is built on. The idea of selling people on the fact that they don't have enough. Selling people on the idea that they don't have enough. And it's easy to sell people on that when we live in a materialistic society that is bound and determined to win with the most points or the most toys at the end of the day. The idea of having enough, the idea of making sure that we have enough material possessions. When you live in a society like that, it's very easy for Satan to say, well, you don't have enough. Because nothing about this is ever going to fill the void that you need. And when we become anxious about these things and we become anxious about not having enough, it becomes easy to try to say, well, if I only had this, then I'd be fine. If I only had more of this, then I'd be okay. And it comes right back to the story that Jesus begins to tell and the person that he's trying to address to say, you need to watch out for covetousness. To think, well, if I only had this, then I could be successful. If I only had this, then I wouldn't have to worry. If I only had this, then all of my troubles would go away. And that mindset is entirely un-Christ-like. It's unbiblical, and it lacks a certain degree of faith. More than that, I would argue that it often gets in the way of our faith. It clouds our ability to access our faith. When we rely on these things, when we seek these things, that is why Jesus is warning this particular individual. You need to watch out for this mindset of covetousness because your life is not tied to your possessions. Who you are is not tied to how much money you make. And while we may understand that on the outside, and while Jesus' statement here seems pretty cut and dry, we often find ourselves worrying that we're not going to have enough. Or perhaps we find ourselves seeking complacency. Now, we've gone through, I wish we could say we've had a half-crazed Mississippi squirrel in the last 2 years, but I think that would be putting it lightly, right? The last 2 years we've had have been something that has stirred things up, that has changed things, that has challenged us. It has not been easy and it has not been simple. It also has not been our usual. It's something that's shaken us up, all of us. And it's something that has pushed us to think about ourselves and rethink the way that we do things. And I think that that's a good thing. Whether it be a global pandemic or a half-crazed Mississippi squirrel, God is going to work in strange ways to try to challenge us to move out of that complacency, because that complacency is built on this concept of covetousness. That complacency is built on this concept of needing to have enough. Well, I have arrived, I have achieved what I need to achieve, I'm good, I can just relax, I don't need to work on anything else anymore, I'm good. But as some of us understand, life is never really something that you just complete. You don't win, right? There is no finish line. The markers that say, well, you made this much money, or you've become this successful, or you've become this popular, now you're done. You have arrived. Doesn't happen. But instead, for us, our life goal should be constantly striving to seek the kingdom of God. And while that may be difficult for us sometimes because we get easily distracted, or maybe it becomes difficult for us because we get caught up in the complacency of life, thinking, well, I just need to go through these motions so that I can continue to have enough. I don't need to worry about all of these things that are going to come up later on down the line. I don't need to worry about developing my faith. My faith is good enough. My faith in God is fine, but I need to really focus on these other things, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. And that's a very dangerous mindset to get into. We've had the opportunity to shake things up, to move out of that complacency. But sometimes what ends up happening is once the dust settles and the half-crazed Mississippi squirrel has been escorted out of the building and things return to normal, it's easy to get right back into the routine of that complacency. And right back into the routine of saying, well, I need to have this, and I need to have that, and I need to do things this way. Christ says pretty clearly here, you need to watch out for that mindset of covetousness. That mindset of going back into this idea that, well, if I can just get here and everything's settled, then life is good. That is dangerous. It takes us down a path that can lead us into all sorts of things that can cloud our faith and cloud our judgment. But more importantly, it clouds us from seeing the beauty of God's grace and God's provision. God seeks to provide for us, and God has told us He is enough. Now, by the world's standards, that may seem untrue. By the world's standards, that may seem absurd sometimes, because there are times in our life where we feel like, I just simply do not have enough. I am at my wit's end. I have nothing left in the tank. There is nothing more for me to pour out. I am done. I do not have enough to do this. But God says, I am enough. Christ makes the comparison that the birds of the air, they don't store things away. They don't have bank accounts. They don't have, a 401k. And yet, they're taken care of. They even are able to provide for their own families. And in Matthew, if you read that account, Jesus mentions the grass of the field. He says, look, the grass is even clothed better than most of you. And what does the grass do other than get cut up and thrown into the fire? And if God is able to provide in those situations, why would He not provide enough for you? Covetousness is unnecessary, and it is dangerous. It often clouds our faith, and it can lead to us becoming sucked in to the things of this world. And I'm not speaking as someone who has not struggled with this myself. I would say I'm probably an expert at complacency and anxiety, and I'm probably more of an expert at covetousness than I'd like to admit. And it's something that I struggle with, but I understand from my days of watching churches grow and fall that covetousness is 9 times out of 10 one of the main reasons churches close their doors. Trying to have what everybody else has, trying to be what everybody else is, and it just simply doesn't work that way. But when we as a body of people come together, as individuals and as a body, to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, there is no telling how God will bless us. But that is what we are commanded to do. I don't know what may be clouding your faith tonight. I know that for myself, I still struggle with these things. I struggle with complacency. I struggle with covetousness and not thinking that I have enough. I struggle with anxiety. And I don't know what specific things may be on your heart tonight that are causing that. But many of you probably are feeling that, especially in this day and time. And I don't know, too, if you are living outside of the blood of Christ, because if you are, let me tell you, if you're worried about being anxious, you really got something to be anxious about. Because the freedom and the peace that comes with Christ, that is something that the world cannot give you. No matter how much they may promise you, no matter how much you may think you have, if you do not have the blood of Christ, you have nothing. So tonight, if you have a need, I want to encourage you to come forward as together we stand and sing.